It's hard to rationally explain the way I feel about Lake of the Woods. I'll tell you a story that has perhaps something to do with it. I was 10 years old in 1950 when my father decided to split our 2-week vacation trip into two parts. The first week would be spent at the Sequest Lodge on Big Trout Lake in Minnesota, where we had been spending 2 weeks for numerous summers. The second week we would camp in my grandfather's tent. One of the things my father wanted to do was to visit his colleague Fridtjof Ander on Lake of the Woods in Canada. So he planned to stop in the Kenora Public Campground, expecting to rent a small boat and find our way out to Fridtjof's camp. Our first night in Kenora proved to be record cold for August, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so cold that Lois and I were bundled into the car and the heater was started. We were barely awake in the morning when Fridtjof showed up in full rain gear with a better plan. He would take us in his boat out to his camp, where we could spend a night in his guest house. First, though, he took Lois and me on the fastest boat ride of our lives, in his Peterborough Speedster with a 10-horsepower motor, all the way from the campground to the fish market. I have several pictures in my head from that stay which turned into 5 full days. They include fishing, swimming, and boating in high waves. But my story is about the morning after the first night, which we spent bundled in down sleeping bags in the guest house. It was still rather cold but sunny. I stepped out onto the balcony with Dad, and the air, though cool, did not feel cold, but rather invigorating. I think at that moment I started to leave behind the little boy who 2 nights ago had been bundled into a car to keep his little tushy warm. I guess for me, becoming a man has always included an element of Lake of the Woods, and we return every summer as I continue my quest. I say we because for the past 44 years, Anne has been my life partner who has helped me define what manhood means and doesn't mean. For instance, in order to be a man, one does not have to sleep on balsam boughs while camping. I am not sure, however, she has succeeded in guiding me to a completely studied, rational approach to the lake. But she did realize what it meant to me, and together we return every summer to the cabin you see pictured. This is a story of how we built it. Lake of the Woods is partially in the United States and partially in Canada. The satellite view shows a lot of open water at the bottom of the picture. That part is mainly Minnesota, with the rest being Ontario, Canada. What you are seeing is a lake that is about 70 miles from top to bottom and almost 60 miles wide. However, that's not all water. There are over 14,000 islands of various sizes, resulting in about 65,000 miles of shoreline. The lake has a long and colorful history, but for our purposes, it's enough to point out that development of all that shoreline has been somewhat controlled, so that in many places there is still a wilderness feel. But back in 1950, the government would still sell you a chunk of land provided you built a cabin within 2 years. Dad jumped at this chance, and from then on, the family summers were spent at the lake. 20 years later, when Ann and I were looking for a spot to build a cabin, the situation was much different. The government had all but stopped selling, and private land was gone up in price. We knew the importance of a good harbor, and we could find nothing we could afford that met our criteria. My parents suggested that we build on the north edge of the Ye Rene property. We would have preferred our own piece of land, but obtaining such appeared further and further from the realm of possibility. Our story begins Monday, the 11th of June, 1973, when Ann and I arrived in Kenora. The previous weekend had been busy. On Saturday, I was the best man for Fred in a full-fledged Jewish wedding. That's the only time in my life I've ever been in a tux, and in subsequent pictures you will see me attired much differently. We had stopped to visit my young flight instructor and his family in Neenah, Wisconsin. I might add that these events occurred after a long trip from California via Provo and Cleveland. But we were in our 30s at the time, and with more than enough energy to spend a few weeks building a cabin. You see the bill of sale for approximately $1,500, dated the very next day. Bill Holmes' barge was scheduled for the following Saturday. That left a few days to clear the site and get ready. I might add that we spent roughly twice as much for an identical sized cabin, 16 by 24, as Dad did in 1951. Furthermore, our siding and flooring were nowhere near the same quality. We spent the 13th, 14th, and 15th clearing the site and pouring 12-inch square cement piers. We located near the north border of the property, 50 or so feet back from the lake, at an elevation of about 15 feet above the lake. The background of this picture looks pretty much like what we cleared. There was no natural clearing, so enough bush and small to medium poplars had to come out to make room for a 16 by 24 cabin, plus some outdoor workspace. This picture of me doing some clearing is interesting on two counts. One, it is a good picture of our old Strunk chainsaw. We purchased this from one of Dad's colleagues who was also a professor of mine. Compared to a modern saw, it was heavy and cranky, and I don't think we knew enough to keep the chain as sharp as it should have been. However, it was faster than the old Swede saw. In the background you can see some red petunias. These were not wild, but were purchased in town upon our arrival. Before we built a stick of the cabin, I constructed a flower box that in one incarnation or another has been part of the cabin ever since. My father joked that it was the first time he'd ever built a cabin around a flower box. The foundation is a crucial part of any building. If you don't plan and build a good one, you'll have problems years later. Our cabins were designed for summer use, which meant we could raise them off the ground on piers. The Canadian Shield location of Middle Island means that bedrock is seldom more than a couple of feet down. On our site, the soil ranged from 2 inches to about 2 feet. Here you can see 2 of the 12-inch square piers we made. Each one sits on bedrock. We made forms out of scrap lumber so we could pour the pier. Pouring only vaguely describes the process. We gathered sand and pebbles from the beach, as well as numbers of small rocks like the one you see in front of the pier. We would then mix a batch of cement using the materials gathered and literally pack the cement and small rocks into the form. The form comes off after a day or so of setting. Here is a completed pier with the form off. On the end ones, we cemented in long bolts so that we could attach the frame of the cabin to the piers and not just have it sit on them. Getting all forms the same height is a tricky job. We used long boards and a carpenter's bubble level. This was in the days before laser levels. We missed a bit on one in the middle and had to use a flat rock as a shim. No harm done. You can see an auger is ready to drill a hole in the beam for the bolt. The chipmunk was not a lot of help with his constant demand for peanuts. You could be working away and find a little guy in your pants pocket searching for yet another morsel. We eventually stopped feeding them, as it was impossible to avoid accidentally stepping on them. By the time the lumber barge arrived on Saturday, June 16th, we had completed quite a bit of the foundation work. Before it arrived, we had cleared space and set out logs to stack lumber. It was loaded at the Kenora's Matheson Street dock, which you used to be able to drive out onto with a large truck. Notice that the barge is constructed so that its front end can get close to the shore before it runs aground. You still have to walk the plank to unload no more than a couple of pieces at a time. Dad looks busy, and Mom is in supervisory mode. Eventually, all the load is off. At the time, we used all dimensional lumber, no plywood or fiberboard. The lad has a roll of roofing on his shoulder, and there's a box of nails in the foreground. They also brought a couple dozen 2-by-2-foot barn sash windows and 2 doors. We had to subsequently haul the lumber, when needed, up the rest of the way up the hill. Notice that Bill Holmes' barge is equipped to deliver propane to lake homes. Nowadays, there are separate boats for propane and construction barging. There are many more lake homes, so specialization is profitable. Bill Holmes moved into contracting and has done quite well for himself. I should also point out that if you look out on the point, you will see the flower box already nicely painted, full of plants, and ready for its spot on the yet-to-be constructed cabin. It took about 3 days from the lumber arrival to build the platform which would serve as the floor for the cabin. The site slopes downward towards the lake. On the near end in this picture, you can see that the pier is not very tall. However, you might remember a much taller one in previous pictures. We constructed 3 24-foot beams to sit on the piers. Each beam consisted of 2 planks that were 2 by 12 and nailed together to form a 4 by 12 beam. As I stated before, these were bolted to the piers at the 4 corners. On top of the beams, we have the 2 by 8 joists placed on 16-inch centers. The headers on the butt ends help keep the joists vertical. In retrospect, I would have done some more bracing between the joints in the middle. You can see the floorboards going on top of the frame. The flooring is somewhat of a disappointment. For both the main cabin and guest cabin, Dad had done what was typical for a cabin and purchased tongued and grooved porch-type flooring, which was nailed directly to the joist. A little varnish or paint and you had a more than adequate floor. By 1973, the lumberyard in Kenora no longer stocked simple porch-type flooring, and the salesman suggested using ordinary V-joint with the V-joint down for a smooth wood floor. The boards were 1 by 6 and had a few knot holes. We have since covered the whole floor with various top layers. So all's well that ends well, but we could have saved a lot of work toenailing all those floorboards. The floor was finished by Wednesday, June 20th. The next step was the framing. The frame was entirely of 2 by 4s of various lengths. We placed the studs 24 inches on center and factored in the numerous doors and windows. We have never regretted that we splurged for lots of windows. We were to use the framing as part of the windows to accommodate the barn sash. The sash was to slide between 2 2x4 studs. You can see a tie between the 2 walls. This is the spruce log we cut. The ceiling is the cathedral type, and the 2 exposed log ties are crucial to keeping the walls from spreading when the winter snows build on the roof. We installed the rafters before starting on the siding. The framing was done by Saturday, June 23rd. Now might be a good time to feature the carpenters. Here I am, the assistant wood butcher, squaring a piece of siding. Those old milk boxes were surprisingly handy and durable. We currently use that one at home in Bloomington to house files. Anne was bound and determined that this was not going to be a male-only project, and she did more than her share of sawing, fitting, and nailing, along with all the painting. Anne can do just about anything she sets her mind to. You see another old milk box in use. It's still part of my shop. The third carpenter was Dad. You see him here with his baby, the old tabletop saw. The gasoline engine driving the saw is off of Grandpa's old lawnmower. We had no generator at the time, so any power equipment had to be gasoline. That engine was old and lacked its original power, but the rig saved a lot of hand sawing. The gray-colored plank in the background originally belonged to Fritz Vander, who sold it to Dad. It's still good and solid, and we use it every year to help service the outboard motors. This was Dad's last major project at A. Rene. He had only 2 more summers left before he died. We were able to start putting on siding on Saturday, June 23rd, just a week after the arrival of the lumber. The siding was tongued and grooved, and it was drop siding made of a 1 by 6 spruce board, and they came in various lengths. Once a board was marked and sawed to a proper length, a pounding board would be used to make sure the fit of the tongue into the groove was tight. We used galvanized siding nails to secure the boards to the studs. Although each board received 2 nails into a stud, it was easier to get a tight fit for the next board if we put in only the bottom nail. We could then nail the top of the lower board, which had previously been left unnailed. Here you can see that we finished framing in the windows with 2 by 4s so that the siding fits well. The corners will be covered with a trim board, so there was a lot of leeway where the siding boards came together. 1x6 boards make for pretty thin walls, but for a summer cabin, they do just fine. By Wednesday, June 27th, the siding was up, and it was time to move on to the roof. Our roof boards were 1x6 shiplap. Putting the roof on was similar to doing the siding, except that you were working much higher, and it's a bit easier to get a lap tight than a tongue and groove. We laid the plank between log ties and then could work from the inside. Here Ann is working, nailing a board from the inside. Pretty soon it would be necessary to work on the outside. When we returned to Thousand Oaks later that summer, we went over to a colleague's house to help him build a garage. His comment was, when he saw Ann with the hammer, "She swings the hammer better than I do." I have watched professional roofers run right up the side of a very steep roof. The pitch on this roof, although not particularly steep, is more than I can handle without some sort of help. Here I've nailed board cleats to the roof, which provide adequate footing. As you go up, you just move the cleats up. As you can see, there's not much to go before all the boards are in place. Our records show this happened on Thursday, June 28th. On Friday, June 29th, we started putting the roofing on. Of course, you can't work from the inside, so it pays to build a scaffold from which you lay the first few lower courses. Felt paper went on first, and then rolled roofing. Both the felt and rolled roofing rolls were 36 inches wide. A full roll of roofing weighs about 75 pounds. So taking a full roll up onto the roof requires a sturdy ladder and a strong scaffold, as well as a little muscle. We did not want to nail a cleat through the new roof, so we tied it in place using long, strong ropes. That's our neighbor and my former coach Briss helping me. We started on the north side roof. Dad, Briss, and I were positioned along the scaffold. Briss on the lake side, Dad at the back, and I in the middle where I could bring materials up the ladder. I went down and got a roll of roofing, climbed back up, stepped on the scaffold, and boom, down it went. Briss and I were unhurt, but Dad hit his head on the protruding Canadian shield and was unconscious with a gash on his head. We were able to control the bleeding, and he regained consciousness, but he did not know where he was, so a trip to the hospital was in order. In the boat on the way in, he repeatedly asked me the same question: "What happened to me?" "You fell off the scaffold and hit your head building my cabin." "Where are you building the cabin?" "On the north side of the property." "I didn't know that." They kept him in the hospital overnight. Mom left a note describing what was going on for when he came to. We collected him the next day, but I'm not sure whether he ever remembered anything about the fall. Work on the roof stopped the next day, Saturday, June 30th. In addition to the trip to town to pick up Dad, we installed 2x8 windowsills and continued with the same on July 1st. On the next Monday, undaunted by the fall and comfortable with my reinforced scaffolding, Briss came back and helped me finish the roof. This was complicated by a 45-mile-per-hour wind that was blowing. You can see how the poplar trees are bent with the blowing. The roof was completed without further mishap. We grounded Dad, however. You can see him inside the cabin working on a bookcase. Like the flower box, a necessary feature of our cabin. The next 3 days, July 3rd through 5th, were spent installing the windows and doors, and we should have a tight cabin. All this time, Ann has been staining and painting. What you can sort of see is how we made the windows, and how we stapled old screen over some of them for ventilation. At this time, we used a fish box for a back doorstep, and the front door was way up in the air, not usable yet. On Friday, June 6th, we moved in. It was just 3 weeks after the lumber had arrived, and less than 4 weeks from our arrival at A. Rene. The cabin was ready July 7th when Don and Carol Ann and his parents arrived. The previous night, which was our first in the cabin, brought one of those severe thunderstorms out of the northwest. As Ann and I lay in bed watching the poplars bend at 45 degrees, we thought, boy, we sure have picked a windy spot. Actually, it's quite well protected from most winds, although when one of those thunderstorms hit, no place is immune. There was still some trim to finish, and I used a chainsaw to cut logs for a back step. We were out of money, so anything we did had to be essentially free. At the time, I was earning $10,000 per year, and the lumber bill, although relatively small, was a good chunk of that. Without a bit for being head residents and Ann's patched-together teaching, we would not have been able to build. July 10th, we installed the window box, as you can see. This is what it looked like after the first year. It took a couple of years before we built a stone front porch, but we had a flower box, a bookcase, and curtains in the windows. It had our stamp indeed. We end our story with another shot of the cabin today. We've added a lot over the years and survived a few storms. We have also worked long and hard on the garden, a portion of which you see. I think it truly gives our place a uniqueness, but that's fodder for another show. Each project to improve our cabin has meant time and work, but I think it's safe to say that we have never worked harder or accomplished more in such a short period of time than in the 3 weeks of June-July 1973, when we cleared the land, poured the piers, and then hammered together the original shell of our cabin.